In the spring of 1889, in the silver town of Hollister Bend, high in the Colorado mountains where the Animas River ran cold and quick, a young woman counted out $11 onto a clerk's worn counter and bought a house that no one in the territory would walk past after dark. The deed she received was water-stained and folded into quarters, and the clerk slid it to her with 2 fingers, the way a man hands over a thing he does not wish to touch. The house stood at the end of Cedar Street, set apart from its neighbors by a wide lot gone to thistle and wild rye, and it had a name in that town that no painted sign carried. They called it the Plague House. 11 years before, the diphtheria had come through Hollister Bend the way fire comes through dry timber, and the family that lived in that house had been the first to take it and the last to be spoken of. And when the dying was finished, the doors had been nailed shut, and the windows boarded, and the whole structure left to the weather and the rumor. The woman who bought it was named Della Marsh, and she was 28 years old, and she had $4 left in the world after the purchase, and a satchel of tools that had belonged to a dead man, and a way of looking at a locked thing that made it seem already half open. Stay with me, because what she found behind one sealed door in that house was not a sickness, and it was not a curse, and it undid a great deal that the town had taken for settled truth. Della had come to Hollister Bend on the morning stage with a single trunk and the satchel she would not let the driver lash to the roof. She had not come for the silver. The mines above the town were giving out by then, the easy ore long since hauled down the mountain, and the men who worked them wore the look of people emptying a well 1 cup at a time. She had come because a letter had reached her, 3 months delayed, telling her that a woman named Augusta Reyes had died and left to Della what little she possessed, and among that little was the right to claim a property in Hollister Bend that Augusta had held under a quiet mortgage for 11 years. Della had never met Augusta Reyes. The connection ran through her dead teacher, the man whose tools she carried, and she had come up the mountain not knowing what she would find, only that a debt of some kind was owed, and that she was the last person left to collect or to pay it. The man who had taught her was named Theodore Crail, and he had been a locksmith in Leadville, and he had taken Della in when she was 14 and orphaned and quick with her hands, and he had taught her the trade not as a man teaches a servant, but as a craftsman teaches the one who will carry the work forward. He had been dead 2 years now. She still heard him in the back of her attention when she set a pick to a keyway. "The lock is not your enemy," he used to say, turning a cylinder slow in the lamplight so she could watch the pins fall. A lock is a question somebody asked once and forgot they had asked. Your work is only to remember the question. He had said it so often that the words had worn smooth as a coin, and they came back to her now as she stood on Cedar Street and looked up at the boarded face of the Plague House and asked herself what question it had been built to hold. The townsfolk had opinions about her purchase, and they did not keep them quiet. The clerk at the land office, a narrow man named Pruitt with ink on his cuffs, had asked her 3 times whether she understood what she was buying, his voice climbing toward a kind of delighted alarm. A woman in the mercantile told her plainly that the air in that house was poison still, that the sickness slept in the walls and the floorboards and would wake for anyone fool enough to breathe it. 2 miners on the boardwalk laughed when they learned what she had paid, and one of them said she had got robbed at $11, that the lot beneath it was worth more cleared, and the house worth less than the nails holding it together. Della listened to all of it with the same level attention she gave to a stubborn lock, and she said little, and what she said was plain. She had bought a house, she told them. She intended to live in it. The laughter followed her down the street, and she led it. That night she slept in the boarding house at the edge of town because the Plague House was not yet fit to enter, and she lay awake listening to the river and turning the deed over in her mind. The property had belonged to a family named Ostrander. The father, Joseph Ostrander, had been an assayer, the man who weighed and tested the ore the miners brought down and certified what it was worth. And an assayer in a silver town held a particular kind of power, because his word on a sample was the word that set a price. The diphtheria had taken Joseph Ostrander and his wife and turned the house into a thing the town wished to forget. What the town remembered and repeated was that the Ostranders had died poor, that the assay office had closed, and that whatever fortune a man in that position might have gathered had gone with him into the ground. Della did not yet know why Augusta Reyes had held the mortgage on a dead man's poisoned house for 11 years, paying the small taxes year after year, asking nothing, telling no one. Yet Augusta had been careful with money her whole life, and a careful woman does not pay 11 years of taxes on nothing. In the morning, Della went to the house with a crowbar and a lantern and a determination that did not show on her face. The front door was nailed shut with 8 iron spikes driven flush, and she drew each one with the claw of the bar, working slow, setting the spikes in a row on the porch board as she freed them. The wood of the door had swelled and gone gray, and when the last spike came free, the door did not swing so much as sag, and she had to lift it on its hinges to get it open. The air that came out was not poisoned. It was only old, the close, dead air of a house sealed 11 years, smelling of dust and dry rot, and the faint mineral ghost of cold ash in a long, cold stove. She stood on the threshold and let it breathe out past her. And then she went in. The house had been left as the dying leave, a house. A table still set with 3 plates. The food gone to dust, and the dust gone to nothing. A child's wooden horse on the floor by the cold hearth, 1 wheel missing. Curtains rotted to lace at the windows behind the boards. Della went through the rooms one at a time, slow, noting the bones of the place, the good joinery in the door frames, the solid plank floor only lightly warped, the stone chimney sound. Whatever the town said about the air, the house itself was better built than its reputation, the work of someone who had meant to stay. She found the assay office at the back, a low addition with a brick furnace and a workbench and a wall of small wooden drawers, most of them empty, a few holding the dried remains of an assayer's trade, a cracked crucible, a balance with 1 pan gone, a box of lead foil, gone white with age. She stood in that room a while and read it the way she read everything, by the marks the work had left. There were scorched shadows on the brick where the furnace door had swung open 1,000 times. There was a worn place on the plank floor, before the bench where a man had stood and shifted his weight across years of standing. There was a nail in the wall at eye height with nothing on it, and below the nail a faint, clean rectangle in the dust, where something had once hung and been taken down. The room held the shape of a careful man who had worked alone and kept his tools in order, and it did not match the careless poverty the town had assigned to the family who died here. And at the end of the back hall, past the kitchen, she found the door that did not match the others. Every other door in the house was pine, light, and plain, hung on simple iron hinges. This door was oak, banded with iron straps, and where the other doors had common latch handles, this one had a lock set into the wood itself, a heavy mortise lock with a brass escutcheon gone dark green with age. It was the door to what should have been an ordinary back room, a pantry or a store closet, and it had been built to a standard no pantry ever required. Someone had wanted this room to hold. Della set her lantern on the floor and crouched before the lock and felt the old familiar quiet come down over her, the quiet Theodore Crail had taught her, the listening quiet. She tried the handle. It did not give. The room beyond was sealed, and it had been sealed, she would learn, since before the sickness ever came. Here I will ask you to remember a thing, because it matters to what comes after. A locked door is not always built to keep a thief out. Sometimes it is built to keep a truth in, by a person who is not yet ready to let it go. Della did not know yet which kind this was. She only knew it was the question the house had been asking for 11 years, and that she had been handed the tools to remember it. She did not force the lock. She could have. A crowbar and an hour would have taken the door off its hinges or splintered the jamb around the bolt, and there were locksmiths who would have done exactly that, and called it a day's work. Theodore Crail would have been ashamed of her. A forced lock tells you nothing, he used to say. It only tells you that you were stronger than a piece of iron, and that is a thing not worth knowing. So Della worked the lock the way he had taught her, with patience and with picks, lying on the floor with her cheek near the cold wood and her eyes closed, reading the lock through the tension wrench in her left hand and the pick in her right, feeling for the pins one at a time. It was a good lock, English made, the pins cut to different heights, and a false set built in to trap the careless. It took her the better part of 2 days. On the first day she got 3 pins to set before the river light failed, and she could no longer feel the difference between a pin that had fallen true and one that only seemed to. The work was not the violent work the boardwalk imagined. It was the work of a person threading a needle in the near dark, all of it happening in a space no wider than a fingernail, read entirely through the small tremors that came up the steel into the bones of her hand. She had to keep the tension light, lighter than a held breath, because too much pressure bound the pins and turned the lock to stone, and too little let them fall back the instant she moved on. Twice she lost all 3 pins at once, the whole patient quarter hour gone in a single careless flicker of the wrench, and she sat back on her heels and breathed, and began again without complaint, because complaint was a thing Theodore Crail had trained out of her early. A lock doesn't care that you are tired, he used to say. It only answers the hand that does not hurry. She slept that night in the front room wrapped in a blanket from her trunk, and she did not mind the dark or the rumor of the place, because a house that is only a house holds no terror for a person who has buried the people she loved and gone on working. On the second day, a boy came to the broken gate and watched her through the thistle, a thin boy of perhaps 10 with a serious face and a shirt mended at both elbows by a hand that had cared about the mending. When she looked up, he did not run. His name, she would learn, was Samuel, and he lived 3 houses down, and he had been told his whole short life to stay clear of the plague house, and he had come precisely because she was in it and had not died. For a long while he said nothing, only watched her lie on the floor with her cheek to the wood. Then he asked her, in the blunt way of a child, whether she was not afraid of catching it. She told him there was nothing in the house to catch, that sickness did not wait 11 years in the boards for a person to come along, that what the town feared was a memory and not a danger. He considered this with the gravity of a judge. Then he asked if he might come closer, and she said that he might, so long as he kept his shadow off her hands. He sat on an upturned crate she dragged out for him, and asked her questions she answered honestly. What the picks were for, why she did not simply break the door, how she could tell a pin had fallen when she could not see it, and the company was not unwelcome. It is a thing children understand before grown people do. Patient work, the willingness to spend an afternoon on a thing that will not be hurried, and Samuel understood it, and watched, and did not laugh the way the men on the boardwalk had laughed. Late on the second afternoon, the last pin fell. She felt it go, the small, clean surrender of it traveling up through the pick into her fingers, and she turned the tension wrench, and the bolt drew back with a sound like a held breath let out. She did not open the door at once. She knelt there a moment with her hand flat on the oak, the way a person rests a hand on the shoulder of someone they are about to wake. Then she lifted the lantern and pushed the door inward, and the cold air of a room sealed even longer than the rest of the house came out around her, and she looked into a space that no one living had seen in more than 11 years. It was not a pantry. It was a strong room, the walls lined floor to ceiling with the same small wooden drawers as the assay office, and a heavy table in the center. And on the table, laid out as if the man had stepped away only a moment before, the working life of Joseph Ostrander, his ledgers, his assay records, the small brass scales he had used to weigh the truth of the ore, and beside them a second set of scales, nearly identical, that Della would not understand the meaning of until later. The room held no sickness and no gold. What it held was paper, and the paper she would come to see was worth more than any silver the mountain had ever given up, because it was the record of a theft so large and so quiet that the men who profited from it had let a whole town believe a dead family had simply died poor. She did not understand it all at once. No one could have. She sat at the table that evening with the lantern and the ledgers, and she read until her eyes failed her, and what she began to piece together was this. For the last 4 years of his life, Joseph Ostrander had been keeping 2 sets of records. One set was the assay office's public book, the certified weights and values that went to the mine owners and the bank, and set the price of every shipment of ore that left Hollistar Bend. The other set, the one sealed in the strong room, was his own private accounting of what the ore had actually contained. And the two did not match. Year after year, sample after sample, the private book recorded a richer truth than the public one. The ore leaving Hollistar Bend had been worth a great deal more than the assayer had certified, and the difference, multiplied across 4 years and thousands of tons, was a fortune. Someone had been skimming the difference between what the silver was and what it was said to be. And Joseph Ostrander, who had signed the false certificates with his own hand, had been quietly building the proof of it in a locked room in his own house. Della understood, sitting there, that she had opened something dangerous. Not dangerous the way the town meant, not sickness in the walls. Dangerous the way a true thing is dangerous to the people who have built their comfort on a lie. She thought of Augusta Reyes, who had held the mortgage 11 years and told no one. And she began to understand that too. Augusta had not been protecting an investment. She had been protecting this room, paying the taxes so the county could never seize and sell the house and let some stranger gut it for the lot. Augusta had known what was inside, or had guessed, and had not had the means or the standing to open it or to act on it, and so she had simply kept it safe, year after year, waiting for someone who could. The next morning, Della went to find the one person in Hollistar Bend who had lived through those years, and might tell her plainly what the ledgers only implied. The boy, Samuel, led her to his grandmother, a woman named Cora Lindqvist, who had kept the boarding house in the town's silver days, and now kept chickens and her own council at the edge of the settlement. Cora was past 70, her hands knotted, her memory clear as creek water. She looked at Della a long moment when Della said where she was living, and then she said, "You found the back room." It was not a question. Della said that she had. Cora sat down slow in a cane chair and was quiet, and then she told what she knew. Joseph Ostrander had been an honest man cornered by dishonest ones, Cora said. The mines above Hollistar Bend were owned in those last years, not by the men who dug them, but by a company down in Denver, the Sentinel Consolidated, and the Sentinel had a man on the ground in Hollistar Bend, a superintendent named Halloran who ran the operation and answered to no one the town ever saw. It was Halloran who had come to Ostrander, Cora believed, and made the arrangement. The assay would read low. The ore would be certified at a value beneath its truth. The shipments would leave town valued at the false figure. The miners and the small shareholders paid against that false figure. And somewhere down the line, in Denver or beyond, the difference between the false value and the true would be quietly harvested by men who had never lifted a pick. Ostrander had gone along, a man with a wife and a child, and a brick furnace he had borrowed against. He had gone along, the way frightened, decent men have always gone along. Yet he had not been able to stomach it, and so he had begun in secret to keep the true book, every honest weight beside every false one, building the proof in the locked room as if the proof itself might one day be his confession and his redemption both. And then the diphtheria came, Cora said, and took him before he could decide what to do with what he had built. It took his wife. The town, frightened, nailed the house shut and would not go near it, and the true book sat in the dark. And Halloran, who surely knew or suspected what Ostrander had been keeping, must have counted himself fortunate that the sickness had sealed the evidence more thoroughly than any lock. The assay office closed. A new assayer came, company approved. The skimming went on a few years more, and then the silver played out, and the Sentinel moved its attention to richer ground, and Halloran with it. And Hollistar Bend settled into the slow decline of a town whose wealth had been carried off twice over, once by the mountain giving out, and once, before that, by the quiet theft no one had ever named. Cora had not been able to prove any of it. She had suspected, she said, as a few of the older people had suspected, that the Ostranders had not died poor by accident, that there was something wrong in the books, but suspicion is not proof, and a boarding house woman's suspicion least of all. Augusta Reyes had been Cora's friend, and the two of them had between them held the house safe all these years, on little more than instinct and the small payments Augusta could scrape. And now Augusta was gone, and here was a stranger with a dead locksmith's tools and the strong room standing open. "You had best be careful," Cora told her. "The company is gone, but the men are not all dead. And a thing like this, brought to light, makes powerful people afraid." Della said that she understood. She had already understood it the night before, reading by lantern light. The question was not whether the truth was dangerous. The question was what a person did with a dangerous truth, and on that she found she had already decided. What she did was the slow work, the only work she trusted. She did not go to a newspaper because a newspaper prints a story, and a story can be denied. She did not go to the law in Hollistar Bend because the one lawman the town had was old and tired, and the company's reach, even diminished, was longer than his. Instead, she did what Theodore Crail had taught her to do with any tangled mechanism. She took it apart slowly and laid the pieces in order where anyone could see how they fit. For 3 weeks she sat in the strong room and built, out of Ostrander's 2 sets of books, a single clear accounting that a child could follow. The public weight of each shipment, the true weight beside it, the date, the difference in dollars, the running total climbing page by page into a figure that took her breath the first time she summed it. Near $200,000 skimmed across 4 years in a town where men killed themselves working for $2 a day. Samuel helped her in the way a careful child can help, fetching water from the river in a tin pail and trimming the lamp wicks and keeping the page she was not using flat under a smooth river stone he had chosen himself for the purpose and would let no one else touch. Cora came to after the first week, drawn by something she had waited 11 years to see, and she climbed the thistle path, slow on her knotted legs, and would not be helped up the porch step, and she sat in the strong room in a chair Della brought for her and read the names of the shipments aloud, while Della checked them against the figures. The ore had left town, under names the company had given each lot: the Idlewild lot, the Consolation lot. The names, painted once on the sides of the cars and weathered now to ghosts, and Cora read each one in her clear Creekwater voice, and the old woman's voice did not shake, but her hands did, holding the brittle pages so they would not crack along the folds. There were afternoons the three of them worked 4 hours and spoke barely 40 words, the only sounds the scratch of Della's pencil and the rustle of paper and Samuel's dog scratching at the door to be let into the warmth. They were an unlikely company at that table, the old boarding house keeper and the young locksmith and the silent, serious boy. And they were doing the work that a company of men in Denver had counted on no one ever doing, because the people who might have done it had been judged too poor, too old, too female, too dead to matter. The dog, settled at last against the table leg, slept through the worst of what those pages held. I will tell you that there were nights Della doubted. Not the truth. The truth was past doubting once the figures were summed. She doubted whether bringing it to light would do any good, whether the men who had grown rich on it would not simply absorb the blow and go on, whether a dead assayer's secret book could touch anyone now. On one of those nights, she sat alone with the smaller of the two brass scales. The second one she had not understood, and she understood it at last. It was a doctored scale. Ostrander had kept it to show how the thing was done, the counterweight shaved by a hair, the balance tuned to read light by a fixed and provable amount, the same amount on every weighing. He had not only recorded the theft, he had preserved the very instrument of it, set aside and labeled in his own small hand, so that no one could ever stand in a room and say the difference between the books was honest error or a tired man's arithmetic. That scale, Della saw, was the keystone. With the two books and the doctored scale together, the thing was not a suspicion or an accusation. It was a demonstration. It could be shown. She had been 5 weeks in Hollistar Bend when she learned that someone in Denver had heard a stranger was living in the plague house. The word came from Pruitt at the land office, of all people, who had grown almost friendly as he watched her fail to die, and who told her, lowering his voice though the office was empty, that a man had come up on the stage asking after the new owner of the Ostrander place, a well-dressed man who said he represented an interested buyer and who had offered, sight unseen, $400 for the house and the lot. $400 for a house the whole town valued at less than the nails in it. Della thanked Pruitt and walked home along the river, and understood that the men in Denver were not all dead, and that one of them, at least, had begun to be afraid. The offer wasn't a purchase. It was an attempt to buy back the locked room before anyone could read what was inside it. She refused the offer, sending word back through Pruitt that the house was not for sale at any price, and she knew that the refusal would tell the man in Denver exactly what he feared, that the new owner had been inside the strong room and knew what it held. So she stopped sleeping in the house. Cora made up a room for her at the edge of the settlement, and the books and the doctored scale she did not leave for anyone to find. She wrapped them in oilcloth, and she and Samuel and Cora carried them out one night through the thistle and buried them, all but the summary she had made, in a dry cache beneath the floor of Cora's henhouse, where no well-dressed man from Denver would think to look. The summary she kept on her person, and then she did the thing that finished it. And she did it not with a confrontation, but with a letter. The letter went to a man named Edmund Fry, who was not in Denver and owed the Sentinel Consolidated nothing. Fry was a federal mineral examiner out of the territorial office, a man whose work was the certification of mining claims and the assay standards that governed them, and a man who, Della had learned from an old directory in Ostrander's desk, had corresponded with Joseph Ostrander years before on a question of assay procedure. She wrote to him plainly. She did not accuse. She described what she had found, the 2 books, the doctored scale, the figures, and she invited him to come and see for himself. And she made clear that copies of the summary had been left with parties he did not need to know, so that the destruction of the originals or of her would accomplish nothing. It was the only threat she made, and she made it the way she set a pin, without heat, as a simple statement of the mechanism. Then she waited. Fry came in the last week of June, a spare gray man who asked few questions and examined everything twice. He arrived on the morning stage with a single leather case and a manner that gave nothing away, and he would not so much as look at Della's summary until he had seen the room for himself. He spent 2 days in the strong room, which Della had restored to its order for him, the books carried back from the hen house for the occasion and laid out on the heavy table as Ostrander had left them. She watched him work and recognized the work because it was her own kind, slow and doubting and unwilling to take any pin on faith. He weighed a known sample on Ostrander's true scale and wrote the figure down. Then he weighed the same sample on the doctored one and watched the balance settle light by exactly the margin Ostrander had recorded, and wrote that figure down too, and sat looking at the 2 numbers for a long time without speaking. He read the 2 books side by side and summed the figures himself, page by page, not trusting hers, his pencil moving down the columns through the better part of a day. And he arrived at the same total she had, to the dollar. On the second evening, he closed the last ledger and took off his spectacles and rubbed the marks they had left on the bridge of his nose, and he looked at Della for a long moment in the failing light. "In 30 years of this work," he said, "I have never been handed a thing so complete. Most men who steal are careless and leave you to prove the half of it and guess at the rest. This man left you nothing to prove. He only left you to read. What followed was not dramatic, and Della had not wished it to be. The federal office moved the way such offices move, slowly and on paper, but it moved. The Sentinel Consolidated had reorganized twice in the intervening years and changed its name once, but the men behind it were findable, and the records Ostrander had kept were dated and specific and corroborated by shipping manifests the railroad had never thought to destroy. The superintendent Halloran was found in San Francisco, an old man now, and though Della never saw him and never wished to, she was told that the examiner's visit to him was brief, and that he did not contest what the books showed. There was no trial that Della attended, no public reckoning she stood up at. The mechanism simply turned, 1 pin at a time, the way she had known it would, and at the end of it a judgment was entered, and a sum was assessed against the men and the corporate remnant that had profited, and a portion of that sum, by a process Fry explained to her and she only half followed, was directed back toward the town that had been robbed. It didn't make Hollistar Bend rich. The silver was still gone, and the mines were still empty, and no judgment could put ore back in a played-out mountain. Even so, the small shareholders who were still living, the men who had been paid against the false figures and never known it, received what the law could recover, and it was not nothing, and to some of them it was a great deal. Cora Lindqvist, who had bought 2 shares with her boarding house savings in the good years and watched them dwindle to paper, received enough to keep her chickens and her independence to the end of her days. The schoolhouse, which had been closing for want of funds, stayed open, and the name of Joseph Ostrander, which the town had spoken for 11 years only as a warning, the man whose house you did not enter, came to be spoken differently, as the assayer who had kept the true book in secret and died before he could use it. The honest man cornered by dishonest ones who had left behind, in a locked room, the proof that outlived him. Della did not grow rich either, and had not expected to. The house was hers, and she kept it. She drew the boards off the windows one by one, and let the light into rooms that had not seen it in 11 years. And she mended the joinery and rehung the sagging door and set the child's wooden horse on a shelf where she would see it, the one wheel still missing. She opened a locksmith shop in the front room, the first the town had ever had, and the people who had laughed at her on the boardwalk came one by one to have a key cut or a lock mended, and they did not laugh any more, and she did not remind them that they had. There was no need. The work reminded them. A town learns slowly what it has misjudged, and it learns best when no one stands over it, pointing. The boy, Samuel, came near every day, and she began to teach him the way she'd been taught, not as a master teaches a hand, but as a craftsman teaches the one who will carry the work forward. She taught him that a lock is a question someone asked once and forgot they had asked, and that the work is only to remember the question. She taught him patience, which is the whole of the trade and most of everything else. And on the day she judged him ready, she let him open, by himself, the heavy oak door of the strong room, which she had cleaned and kept and turned into nothing more sinister than the place she stored her good tools. He lay on the floor with his cheek near the wood the way she had taught him, and it took him most of an afternoon. And when the last pin fell and the bolt drew back, he looked up at her with a face full of the particular astonishment of a person who has just learned that patience is a kind of strength. She remembered wearing that face once, in a lamplit shop in Leadville, under the eye of a man 2 years in his grave. If you have ever been written off by people who never troubled to look closely at you, I would be glad to know it, and to know what you did with the time after. Stories like this one, of the quiet ones who were underestimated and proved patient instead, I will keep telling as long as there are folks who want to hear them. Augusta Reyes was buried in the Hollistar Bend Cemetery in a plot that had gone untended, and Della found it and cleared the weeds from it and had a stone cut, and on the stone, beneath the name and the dates, she had the carver put 4 words. She kept it safe. It was the truest thing Della knew how to say about a woman she had never met, who had paid 11 years of taxes on a poisoned house to protect a truth she could not herself bring to light, and had died trusting that someone would come who could. Someone had, in the autumn of that year, with the aspens gone to gold on the slopes above the town and the river running low and clear, Della Marsh sat on the porch of the house that folks had called the Plague House, and that no one called that any longer. And she cleaned the picks and tension wrenches of a dead man's satchel with an oiled cloth, one at a time, the way she did every evening. The light came low and warm down Cedar Street. Samuel's small dog, a brown stray the boy had named and she had let stay, lay against her boot with its chin on its paws. She set each tool back in its worn leather loop, and the worn handle of the smallest pick caught the last of the light. The handle Theodore Crail's thumb had rubbed smooth across a working life before her own thumb took up the wearing of it. She held it a moment longer than the others. Then she set it in its place and closed the satchel and sat in the gold light with the dog warm against her boot, and the house behind her stood open to the evening, every window unboarded, every room aired and full of light, a house that had held a question for 11 years and had finally, in patient hands, been remembered.